Ladies, gentlemen, today I have invited a book, a green global book. And the book was so good that I was interested also to meet the author. What's the name of the author? Nathalie, the beautiful name, Nathalie Tocci. So Nathalie Tocci is also invited. You never know, sometimes it's good to meet the author of the book. The book was so good that I thought I will not discuss it myself because I am only academic. So maybe an academic discussion has some interest. But as Nathalie, on top of her academic career, is also since more than 10 years or about 10 years non-executive member of a board in a, let's say, Italian national champion for oil and gas, I thought I will take people with real experience. I will take one European, one non-European. The European is Anne Houtman. She's currently member of the Royal Belgium Academy of Sciences, but it's not the reason of her invitation. She has been deputy head of European Commission president staff. So she knows exactly what it is to produce policies in real life with the real group of the president of the commission. She has been director of different things, but she has also been ambassador of European Union in France. So she also knows what it is to steer or to follow what a country is doing vis-à-vis European policies. So it's really interesting for us, much more than me. And that's incredible. We have a similar, very high-level profile in India. In India, France School has created a division led by Shweta, and Shweta has attracted several people like Surya Sethi. Surya Sethi at the World Bank was director of financing for the private sector. So it's already interesting. But when he came back in India, he ended up principal advisor for India in international climate negotiation. Everything we say, India, Europe, US, China, we imagine that certain people are in charge. It was the job of Surya. So very interesting hour in perspective. We will start with Nathalie. I will not introduce her book. She will introduce her book herself for 15 minutes. Then I will give the floor to Anne Houtman for 5 minutes plus Q&A. And after Anne Houtman, I will give everything to Shweta because it's also EU and India, and we have to share equally between EU and India the future of humanity. But future of humanity is easier on the shoulders of Indians. They are 3 times more numerous than us. But we will see how it turns. We start. Nathalie, you have 15 minutes to tell something about this book.
Well, thank you so much, Jean-Michel. It's, thank you for your words. It's a real pleasure to be here. And above all, actually, I'm really looking forward to learning a lot from all of you. And I say this also because unlike all of you, and probably unlike everyone who's participating in this call, I actually don't consider myself to be a climate and energy expert. I'm a foreign policy person who has largely as a consequence of, sitting on boards of well, now it's the third consecutive, obviously, energy company over time. I've kind of started studying the subject quite a bit, but doing so as a foreign policy person, as an international relations expert. So let me start by perhaps saying a couple of words really about the premises that underlie this book. And this book basically really starts from three rather basic premises. The first is not actually specific to climate and energy, but it's rather specific to the European Union. And it's the fact that I'm deeply convinced of the fact that through a green Europe, the European project has been able to essentially reinvent itself. We have gone through, the European Union, we have gone through pretty much, 15 years of jumping from one existential crisis to the next. From the constitutional treaty crisis back in 2005, the Eurozone crisis beginning in 2008, the so-called migration crisis in 2015, the Brexit referendum, the pandemic. The list basically goes on and on. And throughout these crises, essentially, especially in the first decade, basically the European Union had lost its mojo. And by mojo, what I mean here is it had lost that Jean Monnetian art of transforming crisis into opportunity. It had lost basically a story to tell. And basically what you start seeing through basically the European Green Deal is the way in which the European project reacquires a narrative. And it reacquires a narrative that really does several things at the same time, or it aims to do several things at the same time. Firstly, it provides a normative vision. So very clearly, and this is obviously not specific to the European Union, the climate crisis is the most existential crisis facing our age. And therefore, by painting its flag in green, the European Union provides a vision to address a crisis, which is obviously global in nature, but as such, it's also European in nature, given that we're part of a wider world. So firstly, very basic level, it provides that normative vision. Secondly, and not less importantly, from a European standpoint, it provides an economic vision. Essentially, beginning with the Eurozone crisis, the European Union had increasingly become associated with rules, restrictions, restraints. It was no longer viewed as a productive project, basically. It was no longer viewed as a project associated with growth and innovation. Through the green narrative, basically, Europe, yes, indeed, there are rules and regulations, but Europe becomes associated with a growth project, with a production project, with an innovation project, which has been crucially important also to the extent to which the European project is supported basically by the broader public. Third, and related to this, but going beyond it, it is a way of reconnecting with citizens. Especially sort of throughout these existential crises that the European Union went through, there was this growing sense of a Europe, a Brussels that was detached from the needs of ordinary citizens. The way in which, through a green Europe, the European Union essentially responds to the first priority of its citizens, and in particular, younger generations, is essentially a route to reconnect to the broader public and in particular to youth. And then finally, there is a strategic rationale to a green Europe. And this becomes obvious, particularly in the context of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and therefore the way in which we woke up, to the, sort of dramatic reality that our brown interdependencies could be weaponized against us, and therefore essentially the strategic rationale of a green Europe as a way of basically making the European Union also more autonomous, by which I don't mean autarkic, I mean autonomous in world affairs. So premise number one, the transition is exactly, a green Europe is exactly basically what the EU should be doing, because it corresponds to all sorts of different reasons and rationales as to why this is a good idea to do this. Secondly, the transition is happening. It will happen. I mean, this is not a choice in a sense. This is something that will happen. It's not the first transition. It won't be the last transition. The world has seen many energy transitions in the past. And so in a sense, there's no point fighting back against something which in any case is going to inevitably happen in the way in which other energy transitions have happened. However, and this comes to the third premise, unlike all previous transitions, whether this is from wood to coal, from coal to oil and gas, this transition is going to be policy driven. It will not just, quote unquote, happen because of market forces and technological innovation. Those are necessary but insufficient conditions for this transition, because this transition, as opposed to previous transitions, is essentially driven by the awareness of climate change, and therefore the fact that the speed at which this needs to happen is much, much faster. Now, taking these three premises together leads to, in a sense, the conclusion, which is the starting point of the book. And the conclusion is, if this is what Europe needs to happen, and in any case, it's going to happen anyway, but hey, it needs to happen much, much faster, and therefore it has to be policy driven. Well, something that is so complex and that needs to happen basically over the course of the next 3 decades, well, this is, yes, it's a transition, but it's a transition that essentially starts resembling a revolution. And revolutions, by definition, see winners and losers. And therefore, if we're serious, as we should be, about this transition, we have to think carefully about this question, which is why, in a sense, although I'm not a climate and energy expert, because I believe that this is a fundamental question to address, one needs to address what are the social, economic, political, and geopolitical implications of the transition. And it's basically on the latter, on this last set of issues, that I feel I've got something to say, rather than actually on the transition itself. So I try to basically unpack this question by going through 3 separate steps. So looking again at this, the socioeconomic, political, and geopolitical implications, I first zoom in on what this means internally within the Union. I then take one step out and basically ask what this means in terms of our relationships with neighboring countries, both to the east and to the south. And then I make an even bigger step to basically look at the global dimension of this change. So in a sense, it's really a book about, what are the implications of Europe's energy transition, looking at it in these 3 successive steps. Now, on the first, basically, here is a story of, as I said, transition that resembles a revolution. And a revolution that sees winners and losers. And so the question really is, how does this affect potentially, and it's the potential effects that one needs to cater for in terms of policy, how does it affect both the relationship and dynamics between member states, as well as the impact that the transition could have within member states? And the argument that I make here is that we need to address this question, because if we don't address it in a satisfactory manner, either this is going to become an issue which is going to become very divisive between member states, and therefore it's going to run counter precisely to the political objective that it's after, or it's actually going to spur greater inequalities within member states. And so there is essentially the risk of, in a sense, let me put it this way, Eurozone crisis dynamics painted in green, basically, where you essentially have both member states and classes, socioeconomic classes that are better equipped to face the transition, that are going to essentially support, mobilize, and profit from a green economy, to the detriment of member states and or socioeconomic classes that are going to be on the losing side of this equation. Mm-hmm. Now, what I'm saying here is nothing particularly revolutionary. I mean, you could say, well, of course, we policymakers, we know this. This is why, for instance, the European Union has established a just transition fund. This is why it's established a climate social fund? And I would respond, yes, I know that the problem is, we're aware of the problem. I think we're still not aware of the magnitude of the problem. And let me just give you two sets of figures by way of exemplification of this point. If you take together the Just Transition Fund and the Climate Social Fund over the course of the 7-year budget of the EU, we're basically talking of, we're in the sort of, let's say, getting to, well, beyond 100 billion. So it's a fair amount of money. It's not, it's an important sum of money. However, if you look at how much member states have spent over 1 year of the energy crisis, so this is essentially a subsidization of fossil fuels, I mean, because essentially addressing the socioeconomic impact of the energy crisis has basically meant subsidizing utility bills, many of which obviously are powered by fossil fuels. Well, that figure is for just 1 year as much as the whole Next Generation EU package put together. So we're talking about 750, close to 800 billion in 1 year across member states to address the energy crisis, compared to less than 100 billion over 7 years to address the potential socioeconomic impact of the transition. So yes, we're aware of the problem. No, we're not aware of the magnitude of this problem. And you begin to see the potential pushback of the losers of the transition already now. Look at Dutch farmers, protesting against the targets, the nitrogen targets as far as agriculture is concerned. Look at the pushback against, the banning of combustion engines. Look at the pushback in Germany concerning moving away from gas boilers. So you begin to see the pushback against climate and energy transition policies. And unless we address that potential pushback, it's going to either derail or at the very least slow down the process. So on the internal, I won't say much more than that, but simply to highlight the fact of, yes, we're aware of the problem. No, we're not aware of the magnitude of the problem and therefore the measures needed to address it. Moving on outside the European Union, as I said, the second step essentially focuses on what happens as we transition away, the EU, we transition away from fossil fuels. What happens to neighboring countries? How does our transition affect them? And basically, once you start asking that question, you soon realize that you really do need to unpack it, basically, in different dimensions. Because there will be some countries, some fossil fuel exporting countries, that will probably not struggle at all. So if you think about, I don't know, the United Arab Emirates, or if you think about Qatar, these are countries that have, they're obviously very rich countries. They have the fiscal buffers basically to finance their own transitions. So it is something that I think shouldn't be front and center of our preoccupations as EU. What I do worry a lot more about is those countries that are already very fragile. So I worry about countries like Algeria, about Nigeria, about Iraq, tremendously. What happens to these countries that, firstly, that see a very large share of their budgets coming from fossil fuel exports, and most of those exports are to Europe. And on top of that, they are both in terms of their socioeconomic structure, but also their governance structure, extremely fragile countries. I think particularly about a country like Algeria these days, where, as a consequence of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, our dependence on Algeria has actually increased. So Algeria has been an important part, if I think about my own country, Italy, it has been an important part of the solution to our Russian gas problem. And, here we are over the course of the next 10, 15, 20, 30 years saying, well, I'm sorry, we're actually not interested in your gas anymore, which is exactly what we should be saying, of course, if we're serious about the transition. But what are the consequences on a country such as Algeria? And what is it that we should be doing now as a consequence of that future that is out there? How is it that we should be progressively greening our relationships that are currently brown energy relationships with neighboring countries like Algeria? There are then countries that are going to be affected negatively but indirectly by our transition. Essentially here I'm thinking about countries that are going to be affected by the implementation of the carbon border adjustment mechanism, countries like Turkey, like Ukraine, that don't sell fossil fuels to the EU, but sell carbon-intensive products to the European Union. How is it, again, that we can use the time? Ukraine, obviously, at this point in time is a case of its own, but let's take the case of Turkey. How is it that we can use the time between now and when CBAM actually comes into effect to induce Turkey to adopt its own carbon pricing policy so as to make CBAM inapplicable in the case of Turkey? Then, of course, there are countries that actually stand to gain from this. And how is it, countries like Morocco, countries that have huge potential in terms of the development of renewable energy, but not just quote unquote renewable energy. I think the case of Morocco is particularly interesting because I think that as EU, we shouldn't just be thinking about countries that will end up selling renewable energy to the EU, but rather countries that through renewable energy can actually develop their own industry. I think the case of Morocco is particularly interesting.
You have to conclude in 2 minutes.
Okay,
Nathalie.
okay. So just to end sentence on Morocco and just then 2 minutes on global, a country like Morocco that basically already has a fertilizer, an important fertilizer industry that obviously therefore requires the use of hydrogen, which at the moment is gray hydrogen. And so the development of green hydrogen in a country like Morocco would not only be used to export this to the EU, but also to fuel its own domestic industry. Very finally, on global, basically here, I think the broad point to be made is that unlike a brown world in which power in the international system and power in the energy world were connected but kind of different, what I mean by this is that powerful countries in energy terms, I don't know, Saudi Arabia, yes, they're important countries in the world, but they're not exactly the global superpowers. It will be different in the case of a greening and especially a green world, in the sense that because green technologies, decarbonized technologies have a far greater input of technology, it is the big players in the international system that are also going to be the big players in the energy world, which then obviously leads to the question, as the big players in the international system are increasingly characterized by competition, especially between the United States and China. How does that energy sort of dimension fit into this growing global rivalry? There will be some that say, well, look at the Inflation Reduction Act. It proves that competition can actually be an accelerator of change, of decarbonization, and therefore that global competition, global rivalry is good, quote unquote, for decarbonization. I think there's a real, there's a very clear limit to that narrative. I actually continue to believe that climate will continue to require more cooperation than competition. And that therefore, if the broader international system is essentially characterized by rivalry and rupture, there will be a limit to how much will actually be achieved in terms of cooperation, which is necessary if we are to actually move forward together towards a decarbonized world. And I'll stop there.
Thank you, Nathalie. Sorry. As the audience can see, Nathalie really masters the core of the issue, but of course, even mastering the core of the issue, we can discuss it in many, many different ways. I will not do. I will ask Anne to do. And remember that Anne knows what is producing, implementing real European policies. Anne, you have the floor for 5 minutes unilateral remarks.
Okay, thank you all, and thank you, Nathalie, for this enlightening book, which I read with great pleasure, as I told you, and I wholeheartedly share its overall vision, and I would say nearly all its content, and above all its international part. I mean, obviously, a green Europe is inherently global. The problem is global. The solutions link us to the rest of the world. And I think this imbrication should really be hammered out to every policymakers, enterprise, and citizens. I mean, knowing that member states don't tend naturally to think European and are fortiori not global. And the energy transition paradoxically pushes towards local solutions, allowing even a form of individual or small community energy self-sufficiency. Now, I've done my best to try to follow Jean-Michel's instruction, but without wanting to be cheeky. On the one hand, I have more questions than a big vision, given the huge complexity of the issues. And it is one of the great virtues, I think, of the book, that it raises so many questions while providing so much clarity on many issues. On the other hand, focusing on the internal part, as he asked me to do, without touching the external part, is exactly what the book tells us in a way not to do. So I will focus quickly on 3 internal points. First, to me, the EU adopted well before the Lisbon Treaty many energy legislations enacted on efficiency, renewable security, without mentioning the internal market and infrastructures. EU energy policy based on the energy trilemma since the 90s did not really need new competencies. The Lisbon Treaty rather confirmed the greater visibility that this policy had acquired through circumstances without defining new EU competencies. On the contrary, I think by stating that the energy mix and the choice of supplier is exclusively a natural competence, it rather put a legal limit on EU action that did not exist earlier. The same problem of state competence that you mentioned prevented the US from signing in the phase-out of coal. Second, it's striking that the whole of the internal market is not so much mentioned, being both with the enlargement what made security an EU issue and what proved an essential tool to ensure security, but also to promote and integrate renewables and to gain a competitive advantage in grid technologies and other green technologies. And it's also, of course, an element of strength globally, not least in our trade policy, and no other regions, to my knowledge, not even the US, has such an integrated market, which, as you said earlier, for the global part, this internal rivalry to me has spurred a green Europe. Then lastly, of course, as you say, unity is key, but considering their diversity, I think member states are pretty good at finding agreements, and the energy union helped a lot to link different interests of member states, some on security, others on climate. What member states are less good at doing is translating these agreements into practice. And I see this implementation gap as one of the main EU weaknesses, both internally and externally. Now, on the positive side, the EU fulfilled its emission reduction targets, both under Kyoto 1 and Kyoto 2, but not all member states reached their renewable target, some only thanks to COVID, even less their efficiency target. The level of implementation of the clean energy package is still rather low. And final example, Nord Stream 2, I cannot not mention it, which not only put the EU security at risk, but also was an irritant in our relations with the US. It was negotiated with Gazprom after several Russia-Ukraine crises, the invasion of Crimea, and Putin's letter to several governments threatening to cut gas supply, followed by the adoption of a European security of supply strategy, and a few weeks later, in June 2014, unanimous European Council conclusions setting security, energy, and climate future as an overarching priority for the next legislation, through, and I'm quoting, focusing on speeding up diversification as a means to reduce dependency, notably on a single source or supplier. One could not be clearer, but the EU could not do much to stop the project. And I will stop here for the moment before the questions.
And you can immediately react, Nathalie, the way you want. But you are mute.
Yeah. Shall I? I'll just say one very quick thing. I mean, thank you so much, Anna. I think these are really, really great remarks. I'll just add, and I think I agree with everything that you said. So let me just add perhaps one thought, which is, I think the issue really has been, because you're right, if you especially looking at it through the energy security angle, the issue has been that we approached it sequentially by assuming that there was a silver bullet solution to this question. And so you're absolutely right. There was a time in which we thought that we could do energy security. We had the recipe for energy security, and it was the single market. It was integration. And that was an important part of the solution. But of course, there was an external part that we completely ignored. Then, time went on, and especially after 2015 and the climate and the Paris Agreement, there was this assumption that actually energy security was in any case the thing of the past, and we would do energy security just through the transition. And so, in a sense, again, we forgot about the rest of the world in many respects. I think what has been, quote unquote, healthy about Europe approaching this question of energy security and energy transition since Russia's invasion of Ukraine is that I think now there's greater pragmatism and realism, in a sense, in realizing that you need actually all of these things. Yes, you need further integration of the single market. Yes, you need an acceleration of renewables, but then you also need a diversification of relationships, which at the moment are brown, but that can progressively become greener as time goes on.
Anne?
Yes, okay. Then shall I go to my questions then?
Please do.
I mean, I will, it's funny, but my first question relates very much to what you did. I've also done comparison between the Just Transition Fund and the Social Fund with respect to what was spent by member states. So I will not go to the detail on this, but also I've seen that the EU, although it is the biggest donor for development aid in the world, provides actually only 50 billion a year. I mean, 30% of which is on climate, when in the world, for example, military spending reached like $2,240 billion in 2022. Now, my question to you is, do we have problems engaging orders of magnitude, as you said, or are we just lacking courage or even being a bit hypocritical in a way? And in the same order of ideas, on page 144, you point to the risk of new forms of colonialism. I mean, would you put green hydrogen projects that are part now of EU development strategy in that category? I mean, knowing that REPowerEU aims at 10 million tons of imported green hydrogen by 2030, which would require, according to my calculation, 400 terawatt-hour of renewable generation, compared to, for example, Africa's total electricity demand, which is of the order of 700 terawatt-hour, with millions of people who don't have access.
Yeah, I mean, on the funding point, I think, you really nail it. I think that the point is that whereas we have put climate and the transition at the core of our internal policies, and we should be doing it even more. I mean, the point about the Just Transition and Climate Social Fund, but it is clear that it's a priority in terms of what is it we should be spending our money on, especially in terms of investment in the technologies, not as much as we should do in terms of its socioeconomic impact. The problem is that when it comes to foreign policy, and by foreign policy here, I mean development, everything that is external relations, basically. Frankly speaking, we're still in a world in which we're talking the talk and not walking the walk. Most of what we spend on is not climate, be it mitigation or adaptation. Yes, it's true that we're the best of a bad lot, but it is a very, very bad lot, right, in terms of climate finance. And so you still basically see climate and energy being almost annexes to the foreign policy discussion rather than being at the core. Now I just forgot what the second point was.
Hydrogen.
Yeah, hydrogen. Yeah. And then kind of new forms of colonialism. But this is exactly my point. This is why I kind of raised the Morocco example. I think basically what we should be doing is, well, I mean, two remarks. Firstly, we live in a post-free trade agreement world. I mean, we used to like free trade agreements, and perhaps many of us still do. The truth is that even when we manage to sign them, we don't manage to ratify, let alone implement them. We haven't been able to do so with Canada, let alone with other countries. So here we are in the sort of, I don't know how many of you read or listened to Jake Sullivan's speech a few weeks ago, in which basically he was making the case for these new economic partnerships that are aimed basically also at bolstering domestic production, domestic industrial production, but, sort of following through to the argument, presumably they should be aimed at fostering domestic industrial production amongst both parties in a particular relationship. And so going back to the Morocco example, surely this should be about not just quote unquote, sort of developing, exporting, or rather importing renewable energy, but it should be about enabling countries to develop industries along the value chain. So yes, developing a hydrogen industry, which then in turn is going to be developed within a country if there's then a use being made of that hydrogen, right? Which is why I raised the case of, fertilizers in Morocco. There will be some countries in which this is possible to do, other countries in which that makes no sense to do this. But we should be really thinking about enabling countries to develop basically along the value chain. So as we have reached a new trade agreement with Chile. Are we just interested in, importing their lithium, or are we willing, because this entails basically a bending of old trade rules, do we enable Chile to pursue policies which in a free trade discussion would be considered protectionist, that would enable Chile to develop a battery industry, basically. So, I think that is a mode of thinking, basically, that blends what a post-FTA world is in any case going to be about to one in which these new economic partnerships, yes, they obviously have to be in our interest because it's about bolstering domestic production in Europe, but surely it should be about the development of industry in partner countries as well.
Yes, I fully.
And you have 30 seconds.
I have 30 seconds.
Yeah.
Okay. I mean, maybe then just a quick question to Nathalie about a word that was coined by Ursula von der Leyen, probably when her book was already under print, which is the de-risking word. And I wanted to ask her how she sees this, rather as less aggressive word, more as a good principle of internal management, whether she sees how it applies to Russian nuclear in the EU and to Chinese investments inside the EU?
Yeah. So firstly, I think I think to me, the main question is, sort of when we talk about de-risking, why has de-risking been coined in essentially opposition to decoupling? And I think the point is these are aimed at fundamentally different things. So decoupling is essentially aimed at the slowing down of China. And this is because the United States and China are in competition. And so the United States has an interest in slowing China down. Europe doesn't have that problem. Our problem with China doesn't have to do with competition. We don't have any ambitions for global hegemony. We kind of, we've gone past that point, basically. What we do, though, worry about is, given the very nature of China's political system, the ability that China can have to basically, in a sense, weaponize its economic relationship and technological relationship with Europe. So basically, in the case of Europe, China, it's more a question of protection, not protectionism, but protection rather than competition. Now,
but
if we want to...
Please, can I ask you, is there such
No,
a...
you cannot, Anne. No, you cannot. We have to give the floor very soon to India.
Okay.
But just to close on that thought. So what does de-risking mean? And how does it apply to this conversation? I think it means another 3 Ds. It means dilution, it means diversification, and it means domestic production. So dilution basically means, and this applied in a very stark form in the case of Russia, in the case of gas, but it applies in a looser way in terms of our dependence on solar panels from China or critical minerals extracted basically by China. So you dilute basically your dependence. And why do you want to dilute? You want to dilute so as for these dependencies not to be weaponized. How do you dilute? Well, you diversify, which means that you have to develop, again, going back to the notion of economic partnerships with different sets of countries so that you don't put all of your eggs into one single basket. And thirdly, you also dilute by bolstering your domestic production. And to me, it's a question of finding an equilibrium between these 3 other Ds, which is where, in a sense, our European discussion remains still fundamentally unsolved.
You have to stop there, Nathalie, because we are now going to India. India is a single country, but only 3 times the human size of European Union. And
2 times.
Whatever EU does or does not, what does India feel about it? What is relevant, not relevant, etc.? Shweta, you hold the 15 coming minutes with Surya, and you will conclude everything.
Thank you, Professor. Thanks, Nathalie and Anne, for that wonderful exchange. So flipping the coin a bit, looking at how the global dynamics look from the third pole, as we call it here. So I think India is very similar to the European Union in many ways, its geographic diversity and also the way it is governed. So India cannot be simplified into one territory. We have equally many number of states, all from with very different socioeconomic backgrounds. So what works for one region of India might not work for the others, be it because of the economic background or the way simply that the green resources that we have is distributed within this country. So a one-off isolated a headline on India would not be the right way to assess how India is transitioning through this challenging times. But having said that, does the country have set itself some ambitious macro goals? Yes, it does want to add 500 gigawatts of non-conventional sources by the end of the decade. Whether we'll be able to do it, only time will tell, but at least there is these overarching policy targets that's being set which again needs to be trickled down through the governance system. Likewise, we have a 2070 net zero target. I think it's simply also because India is waiting and watching how others are doing that, and it also is acknowledging its growth trajectory, and therefore it's taken a longer timeline as opposed to the other countries. But having said that, while we all have a sort of an equal share in owning the global responsibilities of climate change, but what the reality is the availability of resources to do that. Be it for the green technologies, talk about critical minerals, or the patents or the technology rights, it's not equally distributed. And again, I completely second with Nathalie here that foreign policy and bilateral agreements between countries would be the game changer on how different countries would sort of pave its path. We can do all of the wonderful modeling exercises, but it ultimately would be on the foreign policy officers to sort of make those resources available for any of those countries to actually transition. Take the case in point, green hydrogen. India is very well suited, but whether it will be able to do, because we do not yet have the basic infrastructure set. We need the technology transfer from countries like Europe and the critical minerals from some of our hard neighbors. So that's going to be too many crosses to take. But having said that, looking at the European Union and India's collaboration over the years, they have been successfully partnering through the EU-India Clean Energy Climate Partnership, which has not only been focusing on policy dialogue, say the best things in a 2-hour format and move, but EU and India have strongly been collaborating also on technology transfer, demonstrative projects. In some cases, what was not being able to do in the European setting was implemented live in the Indian setting, and therefore lessons were exchanged. So there has been a lot of development in the climate, be it in the smart grid domain, be it an exchange of how the market works or how networks need to be organized. There's been a lot of successful exchange. But of course, as we say here in India, climate policy is nothing short of managing an Indian wedding, which is a few hundred or thousand even. So you're not going to satisfy everyone, but you try to host everyone with the less complexities. But so I'll give the floor now to Surya Sethi, who will elaborate on some of the challenges that we face from this part of the geography of the world. Off to you.
Many thanks, Shweta, and many thanks, Jean-Michel, for having me. And let me begin by congratulating the author of the book, who perhaps inadvertently lays bare some critical global warming challenges that veteran climate negotiators like me failed to tackle. I say inadvertently because in her altruistic enthusiasm, she mistakenly sees these problems as solutions. And our negotiators like me from the global south actually believed, we really believed, that Europe will lead the world out of global warming, upholding principles of equity and common but differentiated responsibility and respective capability, CBDR and RC, enshrined in the universally ratified Framework Convention on Climate Change. With complete unanimity, I may add, the 2007 Bali Action Plan crafted an equitable deal that was to be operationalized by 2009, befittingly in Copenhagen. I was in the war room where China and US found common cause suddenly, and Europe shred into multiple tatters, let down the bottom half of the world with nowhere to go. The bottom 50% was shortchanged yet again when Europe delivered the 2015 Paris Accord that one effectively absolved USA and Europe, the world's top 2 historical polluters, from their respective historical responsibility for 41% and 23% of the global warming respectively. 2, made all climate actions voluntary, and 3, negated the CBDR and RC principle of the Framework Convention. For the first time in my life, I learned that commitments can be voluntary. I actually lost my girlfriend, though, when I shared my newfound European wisdom of voluntary commitments with her. The author believes that sheer enormity and complexity of global warming and the speed required to tackle it will deliver a green global Europe. The enormity of the problem was well recognized by the 90s, leading to the Rio Earth Summit in 1992. And despite the Framework Convention on Climate Change and the binding Kyoto Protocol that followed, the world is more divided today than it was in 1992. And despite 30 years of negotiations, energy-related emissions and total greenhouse gas emissions in 2021 was 70% and 45% above their respective 1990 levels. What is most disturbing is the fact that even today, the top half of the world, or the global north, as we say, accounts for over 90% of the historical responsibility for global warming and over 85% of the current emissions. And no, India was not in the top half in 1990 and is at the median of the bottom half today. India and the global south cannot solve the global warming problem. The author conjures up visions of a Green Deal delivering a politically and economically united Europe, exercising strategic autonomy in tackling global issues. On the ground, however, what we see is one, a Europe supporting a proxy war that has wreaked havoc on the rest of the world through energy, food, and other supply chain disruptions, and contributed significantly to global warming. And two, a liberal democratic Europe practically on her knees before an autocratic China that is currently the world's biggest emitter by far, but provides European industries a lucrative market, as well as an opportunity to offshore Europe's carbon-intensive production through imports. Suffice it to say that the Fit for 55 Europe and the $100 billion a year support for the developing world that still remains a pipe dream will simply not deliver the objectives of the Net Zero 2050 initiative. On a fair burden sharing Europe basis, the European emissions alone by 2030 should be 150% below their 1990 level. An energy transition in the bottom half of the world will cost trillions of dollars that the bottom half simply does not have. Fossil fuels, incidentally, contrary to the author's belief, do not cause emissions. Consumption causes emissions. And according to UNDP, the richest 20% of the world account for 86% of the global consumption. 86%, richest 20%. Changing patterns of production, that is what we've been doing. We've been shifting production from all over to China or other places. Changing patterns of production without reducing the unsustainable lifestyle consumption will not tackle global warming. Given time, I could share the limitations of the current decarbonization efforts. In fact, both McKinsey and other studies have shown that energy demand will actually rise by 15 to 45% by 2050, that 50 to 70% of that energy demand, higher energy demand, would still be met by fossil fuels, and 70% of the current investment in high emission assets will continue till 2050. I could also show the limitations of the so-called CBAM that is being touted as an outcome of the European Green Climate Deal. And I could also show that the citizens of EU 27, the OECD, and the US consume much more coal than the citizens of India even today. But I don't have the time, so I will stop here by saying that recognizing and squarely facing the bitter truth is the essential first step to equitably delivering the net zero target that we all wish to deliver. I'll stop here and take any questions that you have.
Thank you. Nathalie, I'll give you the floor in the interest of time to react to those many interesting bits that were thrown out. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, to be honest, there's nothing I disagree with. I think perhaps what I should be clarifying is that my book doesn't make this argument. I mean, the that the question tackled by the book is neither what should the EU's climate policies be, nor is it a question about how should the EU be a global climate leader. Both very important questions and very important criticisms that Surya was raising concerning what has been done. It simply isn't the subject of my book. So the subject of the book and the question that it addresses is totally different. It basically says, given that the EU should be pursuing an energy transition, and given what its policies are, that I pass no judgment over whether these policies are enough, sufficient, right or wrong, or different policies should be pursued, what are the socioeconomic, political and geopolitical consequences of those policies? So it's a totally different set of questions. So simply to say, I have nothing to disagree with what Surya was saying, simply because the book tackles a different set of issues.
I'm not so sure that it is a different set of issues. It's essentially the same, because if you are going to tackle climate change, and if you are going to tackle this issue, that gorilla in the room, you can't run away from these questions.
I'm not saying that one has to run away, though. All I'm saying is that it's a subject of a different book.
For example, I'll give you a very, very specific example. You talk of China, you talk of Global South. You forget that, as I said, 85% of current emissions do not come from them.
Well, I actually don't forget it, because I can actually give you,
contributes 14% of the emissions.
Yes, I actually do talk about this in the final chapter of the book. There's a good big fat diagram that basically highlights this point.
It doesn't bring out the problem that you somehow feel that this will go away. Somehow a green Europe will solve all this.
But I'm not making that argument. I'm simply, as I said, I'm simply addressing a different question.
That's what I heard you saying.
Well, maybe I wasn't very clear in that case in what I was saying.
So no, maybe I haven't read it carefully enough, but that's not the issue. The issue still remains that we have this huge problem and we do not have a solution today.
I totally agree with that.
I think I'll just bring in what Nathalie said in the very beginning. Do we know the issue? Yes. Do we know the magnitude of these issues? No. So Nathalie, since we have a few seconds before we close, what would be your 2 or 3 takeaways from EU looking outward, given the policies that it already has? And and then we'll close the floor from that.
Well, I mean, to me, the big point that comes out of this is, if we're serious about what we're doing internally, we have to become far more serious about the priority that we give to climate and energy in our external policies as well. So this is the main point. And this it's not just about funding. It's about the importance that we give this in our trade relationships, the importance, obviously, in our development, in our security relationships. So it's looking at external relations 360 degrees and putting climate at the center. Now, this will not make us the be-all and end-all of climate. We are a diminishing piece of this picture, and that is, I think, also something that we have to reckon with. So to me, the ambition is not even that of being a global climate leader, it's simply being, sort of having a consistent vision and action both internally and externally.
Thank you so much.
Shweta, I must add one short line. You are not a diminishing part of this picture at all. This is a myth that we are creating. Your consumption is still rising. You're not
absolutely. Diminishing in relative terms.
Cannot be diminishing.
Yeah, diminishing in relative terms.
In fact, you are usurping even what little carbon space remains in the world.
Okay, on that note, I think what we can conclude is while the technologies and the finance and everything is important, I think a very important role that people or the officers dealing in foreign policy or bilateral and multilateral agreements would play is of importance. So maybe the next book should be on the people, green people that need to make this happen. So thanks, Nathalie, so much for contributing this excellent book. And thanks, Anne, for sharing your thoughts from the EU perspective, and you, Surya, from the Global South India. And thank you, Professor, for flashing the books. So please get a copy. I think it's available on Amazon, and look forward to more questions probably on the YouTube channel where we'll be posting this video as well and continue this dialogue. So wish you all a very wonderful afternoon and evening from whichever part of the world.
Just full thanks to all of you.
Thank you.
Thank you all. Thank you. Bye-bye.